Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Priority Center. And again, just for any technical issues or for whatever reason, if you guys could all make sure that your cameras are off and that you're muted. And like I said, we're going to have an amazing presentation. So again, welcome to the Priority Center and our webinar on understanding trauma, the wiring effects on the brain and mental health. So I wanted to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Valdez. I've had the unique pleasure of knowing Dr. Valdez for probably the past 10 years. He has not only been inspirational, he's a mentor, but he's also an expert in trauma as well. Dr. Valdez comes with over 28 years of law enforcement experience. He retired as an investigator from the Orange County Sheriff's Department. Orange County DA's Department, is a professor at UCI and also the director of public policy. So with that being said, we're gonna have Dr. Valdez speak for about 20 minutes. We're gonna have our panelists who are experts in the area of mental health and mental illness also speak and do some question and answers, and then we'll open it up live. So really looking forward to a great event full of a lot of information and things that are very kind of timely and needed right now. So that being said, Dr. Valdez, we're gonna turn you on and have you start our presentation.
Hello, everyone. I want to first thank my friends at the Priority Center for having me, and thank you all for taking your lunch hour and spending a few minutes with me. I want to give you a crash course on brains. It'll be real easy. The reason is this: we need to lay a foundation to how the brain works and how it matures. So if we go to our first slide, please. Thank you. If you remember, geographical maps in 5th grade, we had regions of what's going on. This map is of the brain. Imagine north, south, east, and west on a regular map. This is the north, south, east, and west of our brain. The frontal lobe, that first area, is where the eyes are. It's responsible for the major business sections. It's a business manager section of our brain. The side lobes are called temporal lobes, and some of our emotions and speech ability for music comes in there. The parietal lobe up top, the blue area, it has to do with the senses, our senses, and it sometimes coordinates down with the two little lobes in the bottom called cerebellum for muscular movement. And that big area in the back, that orange area, the occipital lobe, is where we process all of our sight information. Okay, so that's generally the north, south, east, west in a very quick and dirty fashion. The next slide. Here are the states of the brain, so to speak. Each area of the brain has certain functions, and these develop with time. I want to remind you that when we're born, the brain is the only organ that's not fully formed. It is maturing. And by the time we are 8 or 9 years old, our brain, structurally, framework-wise, is about 90% its adult size. It grows at a tremendous rate. The architecture inside the nerve connections, that's called the architecture, that forms with experiences from moms and dads, grandma, grandpas, schoolworks, and the environment. And when they are fully mature, they are responsible for what we see here, all those proper functioning of our marvelous brain. If you get hungry, I mean, you get a little angry when you get hungry. Your hunger center is right next to your anger center in the brain. So when you get overly hungry, you get hangry. And then you eat and you feel good. Well, you eat and you feel good because the brain releases dopamine, a neurotransmitter, a chemical that makes you feel good so that we can repeat the behavior again. Next slide. With modern technology, we can actually see the major neural networks of the brain for the first time in history. A bit of trivia, that red bridge between both hemispheres is called the corpus callosum. And we want to note that women process information differently than men do. I'm not saying ladies are smarter or men are smarter. I'm just saying the way the brain works is a little bit different, which means that when we're working with little boys and little girls, young adults, males and females, their brains work differently. Next slide. Now, just understanding the geography, we want a little trivia. If you had to take a quiz, right? Jeopardy, play Jeopardy. You know, from the top, the brain looks like a walnut. If you touch it, it feels like tofu. It's really gelatinous. It actually feels like Jello, to be honest with you. It has over 3 million miles of nerve connections. And to put a foundation for that, if we stack the nerves up in your brain, one and touch them to make like a nerve rope, we could go to the moon and back, which is in your brain right now. Over 1 trillion nerve cells. And here's a bit of trivia. Next slide. If you counted each nerve 1 per second, it would take us over 3,000 years to count what's in here right now. It's a marvelous organ. It's an organic computer. That's basically what I want you to think. It's an organic computer. And we know certain areas are responsible for certain functions: hand movement, eye movement, speaking, cognitive abilities. Next slide. If we look at this, basically we're going to suggest to you that during our lifetime, from birth till about 22, 24 years of age, the brain goes through 5 stages of development. Everybody thinks that we're out of puberty when you're 18. You're not. Puberty ends right around 22, 24, and that's when the last stages of the brain mature. If we look at the hardware update, I'll show you some pictures, but imagine software. Imagine getting a new computer and going from Windows 1 to Windows 10. That's the way the brain works, processing information. If you look at the next slide, you'll see the hardware development. These are some x-rays of some brains. And the brain in the upper left-hand corner, it is a young brain. The brain on the lower right-hand corner is a mature brain. And look where the forebrain is. You can see structural changes. The brain actually changes the shape in our head. There's a technical term for it, but we don't have to know that. We just have to know it changes as part of these 5 stages of development. Under normal development, the brain matures and turns out to be like most of us. Next slide. If we look at this slide, there's something called the social determinants of health. Those are the environment we're born in. Some of us were born into wealthy families, others not. Some of us are born into poverty. Some of us have a 2-parent family. Some of us have a 2-parent dysfunctional family. Some of us have a single-parent family. We're all the effects of poverty. Those are part of the social determinants of health, and they are the foundation for something called adverse childhood experiences. The more you have, the more those ACEs, as we nicknamed them, can influence brain development. Normally, most Americans, we have 2 or 4 ACEs, and we're okay. We develop okay. But there's some of us in dysfunctional families where there's domestic violence, or dad's missing or mom's missing because they're incarcerated. There's an untimely death of a parent. There's family dysfunction, family trauma. High ACE numbers lead to improper brain development. And so those 5 stages that we normally go through, for some kids, they don't go through those 5 stages. And when you don't go through those 5 stages as a young child, as a young adult, you tend to adopt and have issues, social issues, emotional issues, cognitive issues. For example, you might not do well in school. Some teachers reported that children act out because they want attention. Those kind of things, those are red flags to look at. And because of those maladaptive behaviors, the next step is kids grow up to use and use on a daily basis risky behaviors. The way the brain works is the more you use a neural pathway, and that's why you practice. That's why you work out. That's why you play tennis and golf over and over and over. So you're training the brain to use those neural pathways over so it's easier and stronger. Same thing happens with bad behaviors, maladaptive behaviors, right? So if you have maladaptive behaviors and we call them risky behaviors, and that becomes your lifestyle, guess what? There's a greater risk for you to get sick, teenage pregnancy, to suffer from addiction, to get hurt, to be part of the criminal justice system. And we already know that America has over 2.1 million people in criminal justice. America puts more adults and juveniles in jail than any other country in the world. And if we let these ACEs affect everyone, guess what? You can lose 15 to 20 years of your life. That's why understanding adverse childhood experiences are important. Mother Teresa said it correctly. Sometimes we forget that we belong to each other. Next slide. When children are in an environment that have high ACEs, this is called Maslow's hierarchy. And Maslow suggested that primarily we want to have our physiological needs, food, safety, right? those things. And then as we develop, as our brain develop it, we're allowed to learn about loving and belonging, relationships, and learn about self-esteem, and then eventually have some type of self-actualization. Kids with high number of ACEs tend to stay in the first two platforms here. And school's not important. Relationships aren't important. What is important is what? Survival. And so these maladaptive behaviors become normal for them. Now, the folks at the Priority Center are one of the people helping organizations in the county that have tons of resources to help mitigate these things, right? And the three major things that affect ACEs are neglect, right? Physical neglect, emotional neglect, psychological neglect, all types of abuses, psychological, physical, sexual abuse, dysfunctional families. Those are the three major categories that the ACE factors fall into. And the more you have, the more you tend to stay in the two lower platforms of Maslow's hierarchy, which makes it difficult for kids to mature and have a healthy brain. Now, the good news, I painted a dark picture, but the good news is the brain is plastic. We use all of our brain all the time. And believe it or not, every moment, every second, we get inundated with 11 million bits of information. 11 million bits. That's tons. The brain has two functions. It has a conscious function and an unconscious function. The conscious function processes about 40 bits of information. The unconscious function processes the rest of the 11 million bits of information. Your brain is always working, and that's why proper development is needed, because the unconscious area of a brain is where the icky thoughts and all the bad things that happen to us live in a little box, so to speak. And thank God, most of us, our icky box isn't filled up at all, and we don't have a problem with it. But for some people who have high trauma, high ACE scores, their icky box gets filled up. And that icky box can prevent or slow down proper neural development. With the right resources and the right program, the brain can relearn some of those things. We see it all the time, right? For example, my dad suffered a mild heart attack and a stroke a few years back, and he couldn't walk, had double vision, blurry vision, and he thought the world ended for him. And he's 87 years old. And guess what? 4 months later, he's driving, he's walking with a cane, and a year later, he doesn't use the cane. And he says, why does that happen? The brain adjusted. It grew new neural connections to allow him to do everything he did before. That's why I have hope for us. Next slide. If we take a quick peek. Now, you're all doctors. You're all doctors. So doctors, we have two x-rays here. We have an x-ray of two brains. And we know as physicians that the brighter the material is on the x-ray, the more denser it is, the more tissues there. So if you look at the outside skulls of these two brains, you see the skull on the left, the bone, the skull is a little thicker and a little brighter than the skull on the right, which means it is stronger and more nourished. Besides the sizes, and we'll address that issue, look at the internal contents. I'm going to invite you, I'm going to give you a few seconds to look at it. I want you to note that the brain on the left, it appears to be a little brighter, which means that there's more tissue in that brain than the brain on the right. You've noticed the dark areas in the center. There's a term for them, they're called ventrices. There's two ventrices that are really large on the brain on the right. The brain on the left has very little dark spaces. If you look at the perimeter of the brain on the right, the smaller brain, you see there's a lot of little crevices, right? That's where tissue's missing. And some bright students have already noted, I got a chat right now, guess what? The brain on the bottom, you see that point on the bottom of the skull? It's missing on the one on the left, which means that the brain on the left is much more maturing. The brain skulls are going like this, growing properly. So my question to you, my colleagues, knowing what we know about social determinants of health, ACEs, right, and the effect of ACEs, what could cause this? What could cause the size difference? Immediately, I always get answers, it has to be age. The one on the left is an adult, the one on the right is a baby. And that's a good logical response, I would agree. Some people suggest, well, the one on the left is healthy and the one on the right is sick. There's no disease that causes it. None whatsoever, right? Age, sadly, these are brains of 2 3-year-old boys. And you notice the distinct, terrible difference. Next slide. I think we have another picture of this, another way to look at it. One on the right was suffered extreme neglect. Now, neglect isn't physical neglect. It's not physical child abuse. It is mother did not bond with the child. The child wasn't cared for or soothed correctly, wasn't fed on a regular basis. You know, as babies, we all baby the babies, right? The child didn't bond. And what the research tells us is when a child doesn't bond with the mom, the brain does not grow right. And here's the deal. If left without any interventions, without any resources, again, I have to cite the Priority Center. They have resources that can mitigate this. When this person grows up into a young adult, the person on the right, without any interventions, a higher risk of being unemployed, a higher risk of failing school, a higher risk of developing medical diseases, a higher risk, a very high risk for mental health disorders. For example, having no empathy at all, a higher risk for teenage pregnancy, a higher risk for a substance abuse problem, alcohol or drug addiction, and a higher risk of becoming a member of the criminal justice system. That's why studying this and understanding that we have a responsibility. We belong to each other. Our interactions with people, especially young people, build the architecture inside the brain. That's why this is so important. Next slide. So when we look at this, I just asked you to define the response, and we know what the response is. I'll give you a great example. We had a family function a few weeks back anyways. After breakfast, my 2 younger sons were here, and we had a snowball fight after breakfast. I have some cotton snowballs. I have 4 or 5 boxes of cotton snowballs, and these kids from high school, including a Marine who saw combat, and one of my sons who saw combat from the Army, these guys were like little kids having a snowball fight in a house. And there was a young lady here, and she was just kind of standing there. And I asked her later, what's wrong? She goes, my family never did this. I don't know how to have fun. Those are the learned experiences that the brain records that allows you to function normally, right? And she felt a little uncomfortable with a bunch of grown men, including my wife, who were throwing snowballs at each other with my 7-year-old granddaughter. The dogs are barking. It was chaotic, but it was good fun, and the brain adapts to that. Next slide. So I have to ask you, we have a responsibility, and I think Gandhi was right. Sometimes I think we forget that we belong to each other, and he wants you to be the change you see in the world. So I want you to know that our interaction with each other, with our children, all affect how we look at this. And that unconscious brain is where our biases are. And so because we have a natural tendency to only associate with people like us, we're afraid and don't talk to people who don't look like us, who act differently. And they may be hurting. And that's why the Priority Center is here, to help relieve some of that pain. Okay.
Dr. Valdez, I just wanted to, I know that a lot of our, and we have great attendance, by the way. I'm so excited about this. But Dr. Valdez, I wanted to just ask you, and I'm sure, like I said, a lot of our attendees are wondering the same thing. With COVID, does COVID create trauma? Does it increase the ACEs score? Do you mind just kind of elaborating on just where we're at? And again, we're going to have our resident experts from the center also speak to a lot of these points as well. And again, feel free to put questions in the chat for anybody that we can, have the question and answer after our panelists are done. But again, if you don't mind elaborating a little bit on COVID right now.
Yes, first a quick shout out to my UCI students. Thank you, and email me that you attended. Here's the deal. We live in an unprecedented time right now. We all are under a tremendous amount of stress, and COVID has just added to that stress. I'm going to suggest, like I talk to everyone, self-care is important. So my question to you is, if you've had a bad day, what do you do to relax? I'm going to suggest that you do something that raises your blood pressure up just a little bit for 10 or 15 minutes. Because when we're worried, the stress hormone, as it's called, is really a neurotransmitter called cortisol, and our brain's filled full of cortisol. And how many of you, and I bet you everybody would raise their hand, how many of us have been physically tired after a really long, bad day? Everything is going wrong. We get in our bed and we want to go to sleep, but we lie there totally awake. The reason is our head is full of this neurotransmitter called cortisol. When we are experiencing a physical trauma where we have to fight, flee, or freeze, the brain fills up with 4 chemicals. 2 of them, one of them is cortisol and the other one is adrenaline. They work to give you tremendous instant Superman energy. That's why you can see a 5-foot tall, 100-pound lady rip off a metal car door of her car to rescue her baby in the back. The third chemical is a natural pain reliever, and that's why as she's ripping the door off, she doesn't feel any pain even though she's ripping her shoulder out. And the 4th chemical is called oxytocin, the love drug. It helps us deal with the trauma. All of those have a side effect. So when you're stressed out, your brain is full of cortisol, and the cortisol is telling your brain, stay awake, stay awake, stay awake, work. That's why self-care becomes important. Ideally, working out is something aerobic is helpful. But if you don't, walk 10 minutes, chase the dogs for 10 minutes, 15 minutes, get that blood pressure up a little bit because that helps wash out all that stress hormone in your head so you can sleep at night. We need 7 hours a night of sleep, 7. Yes, the brain gets into a REM cycle. It helps get rid of the icky feelings from the bad memories, and you wake up healthy. We, as people helpers, have a hard time saying no. We got to take care of ourselves. I hope I've answered that.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Valdez. I don't know if you have anything that you want to wrap up before we bring on our panelists, but that was extremely, really informative, and I greatly appreciate your.
I'm just going to suggest. I'm going to suggest that remember, all you need is one person. I'm going to tell you, you are a success in life if you can touch the life of one person. But I'm a greedy old man, and I want you to touch the lives of as many people as you can.
Thank you, and thank you again. Like I said, you have been just such an inspiration and a mentor in my life, and I can't thank you enough for coming on today. So I wanted to introduce also, we have a couple questions for our experts or resident experts from the Priority Center. So Beth from Outreach and Engagement, do you mind speaking about the importance of getting early intervention or early help when it comes to emotional distress?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Beth Cohen, and I am the program supervisor for the Priority Center Outreach and Engagement Program, otherwise known as O&E. And I would like to first thank Dr. Valdez for really enlightening us about the impact of trauma on the brain and the devastating effects that can have on mental health throughout one's life. But I'd like to talk to you about the importance of getting help early in order to prevent that cascade of potential lifelong effects of the impact of trauma. So in preparing for this presentation, excuse me one second, sorry. Sorry, I had a technical difficulty here. In preparing for this presentation, I found this quote about early intervention. It says, "We desperately need to tackle the idea that someone needs to hit rock bottom before receiving mental health support. You wouldn't wait for every bone in a person's body to break before you treated their broken arm, right? We know from the field of medicine that detecting an illness or a disease early predicts a better prognosis and opportunity for healing. Well, the same is true for mental health. Mental health is as much health as physical health. There really is no separation." So I'd like to... my phone got raped. It was... Pardon? Oh. Okay, so I'd like to tell you a little bit about the Outreach and Engagement Program of the Priority Center. We seek to reach out to marginalized groups within the Central Orange County region: Latinos, Asians, Pacific Islanders, monolingual non-English speakers, transition-age youth, people on probation, homeless individuals, the LGBTQ population, people with disabilities, and seniors, and others unlikely to initiate contact with the mental health system on their own for fear of lack of support, retaliation, deportation, and/or judgment. Those in greatest need in this county are largely concentrated in the central portion of Orange County, the area served by the Priority Center O&E program. The central region of Orange County contains densely populated communities which are primarily monolingual Spanish, such as in Santa Ana, the largest city in Orange County. Many of those in the communities we serve are refugees or immigrants, and they live below the poverty line. In addition to Spanish, we can also reach out to people in their own languages of Korean, Vietnamese, and through our subcontractor, Omid, also Farsi and Arabic. The Outreach and Engagement Program seeks to eradicate the stigma of mental health and of asking for and receiving help. We go out into the community to talk to people and reach them literally where they're at. We go to schools, libraries, food banks, soup kitchens, parks, laundromats, shelters, rehab programs, after-school programs, to name a few. What we do is we provide free short-term services in the community, to talk to people and reach them literally where they're at, okay? So we provide case management, short-term therapy, screenings for depression and anxiety, one-on-one skill building sessions to improve coping skills and resilience, and educational workshops and webinars on a variety of topics. Since the beginning of COVID-19, we have adapted our services to be provided over telephone and Zoom. While many of the people we see have already gone through many traumatic events and have been experiencing mental health challenges for some time, we are often their first point of entry to normalizing their experiences and to getting help. And in that sense, we are providing early intervention by going to schools, libraries, grocery stores, parks, thrift stores. We may reach people before they develop serious symptoms or problems, preventing further complications and needs for higher levels of service. We know that the COVID-19 pandemic has only made things harder for everyone, creating a sense of grief and loss, extended stress, heightened anxiety, depression, health concerns, and economic hardship, which has been disproportionately harder on communities of color and those who are economically disadvantaged. In short, we know that prevention is best and early intervention is the next best thing. And by providing these, we are helping to build a stronger and more resilient individuals and communities. So perhaps, like Dr. Valdez said, So I mentioned the word resilience, and I would like to give you a definition that I like. Resilience is a process to harness resources to sustain well-being. Think about that. Resilience is a process to harness resources to sustain well-being. This is exactly what the O&E program and other programs of the Priority Center do, helping to create resilience for individuals and communities. So perhaps, like Dr. Valdez said, you can think of ways to support prevention and early intervention in the lives of people that you touch, especially now during COVID, when everybody is having a hard time. And if you are not already a supporter, please think about supporting the important work of prevention and early intervention in which we are engaged, and by so doing, help to create healthier communities. Thank you.
That's great, Beth. Thank you so much for sharing. And now we have Julia. Julia is part of our Children's in-Home Crisis. So Julia, my question to you is, what are some of the best ways to reach out to children and adolescents and teenagers, especially, to start erasing the stigma of mental health? I mean, as we're in Mental Health Week, could you just kind of elaborate on, how can we start to reduce the stigma and allow people to just open up about their own mental health or mental health conditions?
Yeah, definitely. Well, first, I just wanted to mirror a lot of what Beth had mentioned as well. Thank you, Dr. Valdez, the Priority Center, for putting this together. And there's a few things that I want to address when talking about specifically children and adolescents and the stigma that is presented with mental health. First thing I want to address is what we see with a lot of our client and families that come to us. So For those of you who might not know about the in-home crisis program, but we are short-term. So a lot of times we are an introduction to mental health for a lot of families. So that means there might not be a stigma present just yet. Another situation, it might not be their first experience of mental health, and perhaps they might have other prior not so good experiences that they've been exposed to. So regardless of that situation, we will still kind of proceed with exploring what their thoughts are on mental health, maybe what some of the stigmas are, and essentially what the root might be for why they have that certain perspective on mental health. And then we kind of move forward with providing them with that education. And when it comes to working with children and adolescents, one thing that our team has found especially helpful is connecting mental health, normalizing mental health, and connecting it to something that they can relate to. And Beth, I really like the example about the broken bones that you had mentioned. One that I use frequently is comparing mental health to their physical health. Letting them know that mental health is just as important as their physical health. If we have kiddos that are sick, or if they need to go to the doctor for their physicals, they do that. They do seek out that care. So when it comes to mental health, we should be able to see it in that same sort of light, that it is something that can be talked about and should be, just like brushing your teeth or any other thing that we do to kind of maintain our health. But one example that I give a lot is if they are really good at a sport, or if they have a certain interest. They obviously do a lot of exercises or practice in order to become very good at that skill. I use this one all the time as well. If I wanted to go get a six-pack, or if I wanted to get muscles, I can't just go to the gym once, as much as I would love for that to be the case. But they need to start doing exercises such as coping skills. And coping skills don't have to be something that they don't like to do, but we can find certain activities and explore with them their interests and things that they like to start implementing in their everyday lives, sort of establishing a routine and creating healthy habits for these kiddos. And we work with them throughout the time that they're with us in hopes that they're able to continue that with a longer term provider. And then additionally, working especially with teens, adolescents, they always have their phones glued to them. So if there's any way that we can tie in technology, so there's a lot of Instagram accounts that have great infographics talking about mental health or anxiety or depression or some of the things that we might see when working with our clientele. And then additionally, the buy-in that I've used is a lot of celebrities have spoken out about mental health. Michael Phelps is a really good example. He has gone public talking about mental health and the benefits that he's had with certain therapists. There's certain songs that have come out that talk about mental health. I know Demi Lovato just released a song about the importance of mental health. So if there's any way that we could kind of show them that mental health is something that we should all be talking about as a part of our everyday conversation, then that is how we've been finding success in providing mental health services and having them be open to receiving care and continuing that path to a healthy lifestyle, mind, body, spirit.
That's great, Julia. Thank you. And really great examples that I hope connect with our young people. So Shelley is part of our adult in-home crisis. And Shelley, my question for you is, what suggestions do you have about talking about suicide and mental health? Again, September was our suicide prevention month, and really kind of, if you could elaborate or just kind of give us some indicators of how can we remove the stigma and allowing not only maybe a family or a person that is going through this, but also our community to stop, putting the stigma on suicide. So if you don't mind discussing that a bit.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that question. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I think before we start talking about some suggestions for ways of talking to people, we really need to look at what stigma actually is. And stigma is defined as, shame for something that's out of a person's control. And stigma can prevent people from seeking services and getting help. We're making progress as a community and as a nation, but not enough. How you can fight stigma and help is if you have somebody who's experiencing a mental health emergency or needs some help, talk openly about mental health with them. Be aware of your own attitudes and behaviors. Choose your words carefully. Be supportive of that person. Educate yourself about stigma and about mental health issues. encourage equality in regard to mental illness and physical health, which both Beth and Julia mentioned. You need to show compassion, choose empowerment over shame. Shame is one of the major reasons people tend to not seek help, even though help is available. Mental health issues are not anybody's fault. And stigma, often when we think about stigma, people are blamed for what they're dealing with. A few suggestions when you're speaking to somebody who needs help and is seeking help is express concern without judgment. Listen, stay calm. Do not make any positive statements or try to cheer them up. Just listen. Being non-judgmental is the best way to help somebody and show that you are listening. Ask directly about a plan. A plan is much more serious than someone having thoughts. Instill hope that feelings can improve. Seeking help for therapy, meds, and problem solving. I'm going to talk a little bit more about my program at the end, and this is kind of where we come in. Tell a family member if needed. Don't be sworn to secrecy if somebody discloses to you that they're having thoughts of hurting themselves or others. Be supportive and check back in with that person. Discuss a safety plan. A safety plan might include something like hotline numbers, people they can call if they need to talk, activities that they can engage in to improve their mood when they're experiencing a crisis. And you may need to call for help if you're unable, if the person is unable or unwilling to commit to a safety plan. In regard to COVID, COVID has created a unique experience in that there's COVID around stigma around COVID, being that COVID can make people feel really isolated since we've been in our homes, abandoned. It's increasing depression and anxiety. People, like I said in the beginning, when I define stigma, who experience stigma are much less likely to seek help and treatment, and it is available. Stigma around COVID and how we got stigma around COVID is it's associated with the lack of knowledge about the spread, a need to blame somebody for what's going on and what we're all going through, fear, anxiety, fear of death. There's a lot of gossip, rumors that are swirling around. Stigma can be a big barrier to seeking help that is available. Our program, I am the program supervisor for adult in-home crisis, and we are a short-term intensive program that's generally 3 weeks in duration, 21 days. We offer a clinician, a peer mentor, and a case manager. We also include family if the client desires to have somebody. It can be a family member, a friend, and they're seen generally 3 times a week. And our goal is to link them to long-term services, be that therapy, medication through a psychiatrist, groups, supportive community services, or case management needs that they may need, you know, housing. Sometimes they're very basic needs, housing, food, things like that. And sorry, I just lost my train of thought. And most of our referrals come currently from the CAT team, which is our centralized assessment team. If somebody's experiencing a mental health emergency in Orange County, often CAT is called, and they will go out and evaluate to determine if the person needs to go to the hospital for a 5150. Generally, if the person is in a mental health crisis but does not require 5150, that is when we are called to come in and kind of bridge that gap between the mental health crisis, the 5150, and the incident that brought CAT out there, to getting them linked to a more long-term service. So we're kind of that Band-Aid that holds it together until we can pass them on to a long-term provider. We also get referrals from our CSU, which is our clinical services unit. We have one located in Santa Ana and one also in Costa Mesa. And so it's a little bit about my program and my thoughts on stigma and COVID.
Shelley, thank you. And if you look in the chat, you have a lot of great, appreciation for those points. And I think that that's one of the things about even removing the stigma is that we need to be able to talk about it. And I think a lot of people are fearful. If I ask someone that may be suicidal, if they've made a plan, maybe then they'll commit suicide, and really those are just really great factual pieces that I think that we all need to kind of reflect on and learn more about. So thank you. Yes. And again, thank you to our panelists. We're going to open it up to questions and answers, but also I just wanted to let you know that we'll also send out a follow-up email from today's event with the recording for those of you guys that want to go back and maybe kind of listen again or share it with somebody else. But also the bios of the speakers will also be on there. And we'll also send out a certificate of attendance for professional development. So if we can have all our panelists turn your mics on and your cameras, that would be great. So one of the questions that we have, and again, feel free for any or all of you guys to add some input in there too, but I think that this relates to kind of the ACEs point. Is there a different impact on witnessing or experiencing traumatic events on a younger child versus an older child, or not necessarily, or is it the same? So if somebody wants to elaborate on that.
I think I can definitely offer some, maybe not expert advice, but I can definitely offer to what we see as part of our program in regards to children that might have had some prior experiences of trauma. And a lot of times we can't really pinpoint when that trauma will manifest in their behaviors. There's no kind of rule book or criteria. Sometimes it depends on the child, it depends on the experience. And I think Beth touched a little bit on resilience as well. So a situation that could be particularly damaging or traumatic for one child might not be the same for for another child or another child of a different age. So in relating to that question, I think there might be some correlation, but we really kind of take the child individually, case by case, and kind of take a lot of things into consideration as pertaining to their trauma and also their level of resiliency as well.
Great, Julia. Anybody else want to elaborate on that question?
I would just say that I think in general, the longer one experiences trauma and from an earlier age, generally speaking, the worse the outcome. So if you can have a trauma that is one isolated incident, and if there are good protective factors and a good level of resilience, you're likely to bounce back from that. But if it's repeated trauma and over a span of years or a lifetime, obviously that predicts a worse outcome.
Super. Anybody else from the panel?
I would talk, I'd like to say a little bit about, as working in the adult in-home crisis program, I would say a large percentage of our clients have endured trauma, generally in childhood, but also some in adulthood. And I think one of the outcome measures is when they get help and when they seek help. And that's what's so important about, say, Beth's program, outreach and engagement. The earlier we can get somebody and help them. So if somebody's traumatized as a child, receiving services in Beth or Julia's program, they can have a more positive outcome a lot earlier than when we get them much later in life. But there is hope, and absolutely we can work on those things and people can overcome trauma. And I think that's the most important message to put out.
Yeah, great point. Excellent. It's fix them, now or later, so absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. So another question we had, and this is actually, and again, this is also Domestic Violence Awareness Month as well. But I think one of the questions that was asked is based on kind of adulthood, that as an adult, if you may not have experienced trauma as a child, but as an adult, for example, in an abusive relationship, does that have the same traumatic effects as, I guess, Dr. Valdez, you talked about with brain, not so much the brain development, but brain size and trauma to the brain. So if anybody would like to speak about that?
I can speak about that since that's related to adults. There's so many variables to answer that question. I don't know so much about, that's more Dr. Valdez, as far as the brain and what it actually does physically to the brain. In relation to recovering, I think there's, again, a multitude of factors. Like Beth said, if it's for a longer duration, if it's more severe, another outcome measure can be, how long it took them to seek help, what kind of a support system they have. There's a lot of different factors that go into recovery. But again, I think the most important message to get it out is that there is recovery and it's possible, be that, as a young child, in your adolescence, or as an adult.
Excellent. Somebody else. Like I said, I think that this is a really important question as well. Dr. Valdez, are you still somehow connected here?
I've been listening. There's a dose-dependent relationship. Young people who have consistent exposure to trauma are sort of in a hyper alert stage. And sometimes, as correctly mentioned, they don't know how to tell you about it. We'll see regressions in behaviors, bedwetting, childlike regressions, behaviors that just aren't consistent with their age. The older we are, if you've experienced trauma your whole entire life, that affects your brain development, and you might not have a good affect. You might not be able to relate well. If we are 25 years old and something traumatic happens to us for the very first time of our life, those four chemicals mess up the way that we remember things. And those patients may present themselves, or victims or survivors, I like to call them, with a whole different myriad of characteristics. There's no affect. There's a flat affect. They have island memories. Imagine that happening over and over and over to a small child. And then we put them in school and we want them to learn. They look at the world totally different because they're stuck in that very first base of Maslow's hierarchy. It's difficult. And as correctly noted by our panel, very astute observation, everyone's different. And depending on what type of coping mechanisms you have and develop, that kind of lies or makes the foundation of how you handle the trauma. In the real world, if something bad happens, we'll say COVID, about 1/3 of us have a very mild reaction, generally speaking. Another 1/3 of us may have a moderate reaction, and another 1/3 of us may have an extreme reaction. And everybody's different, right? And nobody wears a hat. We're not born with a tab of what we can or can't take. Those are learned behaviors that we get from our significant others and our survival skills.
Thank you, Dr. Valdez. And from both of our law enforcement experience, we also refer to it as our fight and flight, and I think that also this is, a lot of times, and this will lead me into the next question of why we see a lot of kids that get punished in our school systems as well, is that, we're not understanding where a lot of these traumatic events come from. And like I said, the behavioral issues that sometimes our schools are not prepared for, our communities are, problematic as well. So this leads into the question about incarcerated juveniles having high or extreme high rates of unmet mental health needs. You and I that have, taught and worked, hand in hand with a lot of our young people have seen this in juvenile hall or juvenile facilities. So, looking at kids in incarceration, do you want to talk about kind of the mental health issues there as well?
There's tons of mental health issues that we don't deal with, quite frankly, or honestly want to. That's the big elephant in the room for kids in incarceration. As a nation, I think we'd rather treat a symptom than a cause. And that's why the folks at the Priority Center, our mental health panel of experts, they look at reasons why something happened. And they don't just say, take an aspirin and get rid of it. Putting a young person in juvenile hall many times is just taking an aspirin for a headache. We don't look at the reasons why the children were involved in those behaviors. And unfortunately, as you're well aware, and many of us are aware, juvenile halls are full of felons, not a different type of criminal than was 30 or 40 years ago. When I was a young man, if you were incorrigible, the police would come and put you in juvenile hall for a couple of days until you obey your parents. There's no incorrigibles in juvenile hall now. They're felons, murderers, attempted murderers, sexual assault, rapists, arsonists, drug dealing. We've come to a point where we ignore what causes that. We just put people in jail. That's why we have more people in jail than any other country in the world. And it's shameful we don't address those issues.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think it also lends to why we're starting to create a lot of more mental health conditions, So some of the other questions here, and like I said, have about 3 to 5 minutes left on the question and answers, but just looking at COVID and the heightened awareness of, supporting our children today, and also childhood trauma, what can we do to, help the causation? And, again, I think that this is why organizations like the Priority Center are important, that if we don't start recognizing early trauma like child abuse, and child abuse comes in, many different fashions. It's not just physical abuse, it's mental, emotional, it's neglect, that create our kind of adult conditions as well too. So again, this is part of the reason why the importance of having a panel discussion or an open discussion to really educate our communities on, we all have a hand in helping out, so again, I'll turn it back to the panel, but we have about, like I said, 3 to 4 minutes left. Go ahead, Dr. Valdez, if you'd like to answer. Like I said, just basically, what can we do to lessen the impact of childhood trauma, or what can we do today to just support our young people?
As you're well aware, many people were, my bailiwick is gangs and gang behaviors. I'm going to suggest something, that this all starts at home. With a good, healthy family, whether you're a single parent or a dual parent, that relationship the parent has with the child lies the foundation for behaviors as young adults, as teenagers, and for the rest of our lives. Those relationships are very important. But in today's world, because we live in a state that's the most expensive state to live in the United States, we have the highest taxes, the highest gas taxes, the highest real estate taxes. Oftentimes, both parents need to work. And what we're finding out from the research is that parents talk at their children somewhere between 3 and 8 minutes a day. And how do you know what's going on in your child's life if you talk at them? Well, I'm going to be late for work. Put the food in the microwave, feed the dogs, do your homework, take care of your little sister, and I'll see you tonight. I love you. And it's not because parents want to do that. It's because they do it to survive. And you don't have time to play and have a snowball fight in the middle of August in 100-degree weather and watch your kids laugh and find out what's important to them. We need that. We need to go back to that. We need to remember that we belong to each other. We need to remember that our relationships are very special, and the parent-child relationship, the grandparent-child relationship, the aunt-child relationship, the uncle-child relationships are crucial. They help lay the foundation for behaviors, and they give our kids good coping skills. Kids watch everything at home. So if the parents are yelling and hitting each other and the F-bombs are kind of off like crazy, when they get mad, they're going to think that's normal behavior. We need to set the example as adults. That's what we need to do. And it's hard in today's world. And my hand goes out to parents. We have 15% of the US population living at or beneath the poverty level. How do we help those kids? How do we reach out to them? Well, you volunteer. You do what people do. You join the Priority Center. You join a nonprofit. You help the people in community. It helps you as well as them. Because when we help others, reality is we're really working together.
Dr. Valdez, thank you so much. To our panelists, thank you as well. And just to kind of piggyback on what Dr. Valdez talked about, we also need to make it okay if we don't know how to parent. Not all of us, have grown up with great role models, and that when we don't have good role models, that we're allowed to be able to say, I don't understand this, or I need help. So being able to engage in allowing the stigma of saying I need some help, or I need a break, or I don't understand what this looks like has to be okay too. And that, like I said, get out there, motivate, anybody that we can. I think that that's one of the biggest things about my leaving my law enforcement career, going into education, is that I want to empower my students to be part of this change. And again, being able to have open dialogues or community dialogues like this are very important. So again, I want to thank you as a board member here at the Priority Center. I couldn't be more proud of the fantastic work that our clinicians have done, and people on the front line and in the office, really kind of to make this just time in our lives successful. And so now I want to turn it over to our executive director. Lisa, are you on?
Yeah.
So Lisa, thank you. And thank you for allowing us this time, and really to your position, you've done a great job. So thank you again, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I would like to take this opportunity to really say thank you to everyone that's participated today and that has had the opportunity to hear all of our panelists speak, as well as I want to thank Dr. Al Valdez. He did an outstanding job. Thank you so much, Al, for everything you shared today. It was enlightening and it was very helpful and insightful. I'd also like to thank Vanessa for creating this idea of bringing all these great people together, and for her vision and making it happen. So thank you, Vanessa, as a board member. She's so creative and innovative, and we're very blessed to have her as an active board member who really makes things happen. And I'm thankful for that. And I also would like to take a moment to thank our staff, our team members who participated in the panel today, who really you can see their passion and their abilities and skills as they talk and share at all the different levels of communication, and their ability to really reach out and make a difference in the work that we do, whether it's with children or the general community at large through outreach and engagement, or in-home adult crisis. I'm very impressed. Their work, all of the staff that we have here, the 123 employees that we have here, are what inspires me to get up every day and come here. We have an amazing team that really is committed to making a difference in our community. And that's what sets forth, our mission is to end the generational cycle of trauma. So really, I'm so grateful for this group. I'm grateful for this panel. And once again, you will be receiving an email from the Priority Center with the link and the recording of this session. And please feel free to share it with others, and hopefully it will make a difference and an impact, so we can pay that forward. And I hope you have a great rest of your week, but I think it's really important that we educate ourselves on mental health and about mental illness, and we educate others. So, and that we choose our words carefully and how we share and how we listen and help others and support people around us who are struggling. Together we can make a difference and we can end the stigma. And I'd like to thank everyone for participating in today's session. Thank you.
Thank you again, and thank you, and please stay safe. Take care, everybody.
Bye.